Obrigada.
Ah, ok.
Ótimo. Tá tudo certo.
Tudo bem, gente? Então, podemos começar? Maravilha. Então, é um imenso prazer para mim, abrir essa... Oi! We have to use the microphone. That's very important. Okay. So, é um imenso prazer para mim dar as boas-vindas a todas, a todos e todes, mas também, em particular, ao professor Abdulmalik Simon, que está nos visitando essa semana aqui na USP, graças à Comissão de Cooperação Internacional da FEFELESH, a CCINT, e com o apoio financeiro da Comissão de Cultura e Extensão, na verdade, a Pró-Reitoria de Cultura e Extensão da USP, que está financiando essa estada, de 9 professores, não sei se vocês têm acompanhado, aí a Winter School, que está acontecendo ao longo dessa semana aqui na nossa FEFELESH. E é nesse contexto que o professor Malik veio dar um curso que começou na segunda-feira, segunda, terça, quinta e sexta, sempre das 6 às 9, que está sendo um sucesso. E nesse contexto, então, nós, aproveitando, né, o professor André, que organiza aqui os seminários, o ciclo de seminários, a gente conversou e decidiu, então, utilizar essa oportunidade única, né, não apenas para trazer o professor Malik, mas para também fortalecer os nossos laços da sociologia com a ciência política, né? E no âmbito desse ciclo de seminários. E aí a professora Fernanda Lima Silva topou também participar como debatedora. Então, nós vamos ter alguém debatendo por parte da ciência política e também a nossa colega aqui, que está ligada ao Departamento de Sociologia, Laura Kema, né? Eu do Departamento de Sociologia. Então, assim, para não tomar muito tempo, eu só gostaria de fazer uma breve apresentação, né, de cada um dos nossos membros aqui da mesa, para vocês um pouco situarem, né? E poderem um pouco já imaginar um pouco como vai ser a nossa discussão. A ideia é que o professor Malik vai falar por volta de uns 40, 50 minutos, e aí cada uma das debatedoras tem mais ou menos uns 10 minutos, para a gente ainda ter um tempinho para discutir um pouco amplamente até a 13h, tá bom? Então, eu gostaria de dizer, então, que o professor Abdulmalik Simon, tudo bem eu falar português aqui, depois eu passo para o inglês, né? O professor Abdulmalik Simon nasceu na cidade de Wisconsin, nos Estados Unidos, e nós estamos aprendendo aqui no curso de família libiana, né? São imigrantes que vieram da Líbia, foram da Líbia para os Estados Unidos. Ele é um urbanista que se sensibiliza, em particular, pelas formas emergentes de vida coletiva nas cidades do chamado Sul Global. É professor emérito sênior do Urban Institute, da Universidade de Sheffield, no Reino Unido, é co-diretor de um laboratório chamado Beyond Inhabitation, né, da Universidade Politécnica de Turim, né, que justamente se preocupa com formas de habitar o urbano, né, e aí em torno da questão também do morar nas ruas, né, e fellow do Instituto Canadense de Pesquisa Avançada. Ademais, ele é professor visitante no African Center for Cities, na Universidade de Cape Town, e pesquisador associado do Rujak Center for Urban Studies em Jacarta. Ele vive em Jacarta há muitos anos, mas transita muito vigorosamente pelo mundo todo, em particular aqui pelas cidades africanas e também pela Europa, né? Por 3 décadas ele trabalha sobre intercâmbio cultural, arranjos técnicos, economia local e também a constituição de relações de poder que afetam o modo como cidades heterogêneas da África e do Sudeste Asiáticas são vivenciadas dia a dia. O enfoque dele tem sido constituir também, e esse é o lado 2 aqui da presença dele aqui no Brasil, ele está passando 6 meses na Universidade Federal da Bahia, né? Desde maio ele está lá e está trabalhando em torno da constituição justamente de uma instituição, de um centro de estudos e pesquisas, mas também de engajamento em ativismo em torno da questão enfim, no fundo, da questão racial, mas, em particular, justamente disso que ele vem trabalhando para pensar o urbano, que é a noção de black urbanities, né, de urbanidades negras, que ele vai trazer aqui. O enfoque tem sido justamente constituir instituições viáveis, capazes de se engajar com as complexidades da vida em meio a esse mundo em que a gente vive, né? E só brevemente, algumas traduções para o português eu não encontrei, na verdade encontrei alguns capítulos, né? Ou às vezes artigos, né? Tem trechos. O Inabitável, né? Uma tradução de 2019, que está na revista Eco Pós, né? Do Rio de Janeiro. Mas publicações mais recentes dele é o livro Surrounds, né, que é a vida urbana no interior e para além da captura. Quem está dizendo isso é a minha tradução livre, mas também Vidas Improvisadas, de 2019, né, no âmbito do qual, esse livro, no âmbito do qual ele desenvolveu essa noção de endurance, né, que foi traduzida aqui para o português como resistência, mas eu pessoalmente acho que é mais interessante, rende mais e está mais próximo do que o professor propõe, que é a noção de persistência, né? Mas, enfim, isso já é em si um tema para debate. Então, agora, muito brevemente, a professora Laura Kem é pesquisadora urbana que atua de forma interdisciplinar, conectando teorias e métodos da antropologia, da geografia e da teoria feminista, com reflexões sobre o urbano, e aí, mais recentemente, também com a sociologia. Com uma graduação em ciência política e mestrado em estudos latino-americanos, você me corrija se eu estiver errado, né? Fez com aí, no caso, né, muito em trocas com o Sérgio Costa, o sociólogo Sérgio Costa, na Universidade Livre de Berlim. Ela fez o doutorado dela em antropologia urbana na Universidade Hafencity de Hamburgo, e desde então vem trabalhando sobre desde essa época, já tem trabalhando sobre as duas metrópoles brasileiras, Rio de Janeiro e São Paulo, explorando o quanto a produção cotidiana do espaço urbano deve a interações dos seres humanos com as infraestruturas técnicas que impregnam o nosso dia a dia, e, mais recentemente, também as nossas interações com o chamado mundo multiespécies, ou seja, de águas, plantas, insetos, animais que nos envolvem e que somos, né? Depois de trabalhar como pós-doutoranda e professora convidada na Universidade Humboldt de Berlim e no Center of Metropolitan Studies da Universidade Técnica de Berlim, ela ingressou em 2023 como professora da Cátedra Matos de Sustentabilidade Urbana da FEFELESH, e justamente como professora ligada precisamente ao nosso departamento de Sociologia. No ano passado, nós coordenamos juntas, Laura e eu, um projeto de pesquisa e extensão universitária justamente sobre as chamadas ecologias evidenciadoras nos bairros do Bexiga e do Glicério, né, no âmbito daquele projeto mais amplo do Global Center of Spatial Methods for Urban Sustainability, que eu coordenei no Departamento de Sociologia entre 2020 e 2022, no âmbito de um convênio internacional entre a FEFELESH e a Universidade Técnica de Berlim. E a Fernanda Lima e Silva é professora do Departamento de Ciência Política e pesquisadora do Centro de Estudos da Metrópole. Ela possui graduação em Relações Internacionais, aqui pela USP, o mestrado e o doutorado em Administração Pública e Governo pela Escola de Administração de Empresas de São Paulo, da Faculdade da Fundação Getúlio Vargas, e o pós-doutorado também pela Fundação Getúlio Vargas e a Escola de Administração, no âmbito da pesquisa Dados à Prova d'Água, engajando atores na governança sustentável dos riscos de inundação para a resiliência urbana, em parceria com a Universidade de Warwick e a Universidade de Heidelberg. Foi diretora de organizações não governamentais, como a Rede Internacional de Ação Comunitária Slum Dwellers International e a Teto Brasil, que é uma ONG formada por jovens voluntários e voluntárias que implementam iniciativas de moradia e habitat em favelas precárias. Também foi professora colaboradora, justamente na Escola de Administração da GV, e pesquisa temas relacionados à análise de políticas públicas, incluindo a implementação e avaliação de políticas públicas, a burocracia e as relações intergovernamentais, com ênfase em políticas sociais, socioambientais e urbanas. Então, é isso, e eu passo a palavra para o professor Malik. Tá bom? No microfone.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks for hosting me.
I will sometimes do this, yes, very, very discreetly, for them to. When she tells me that I have to do this, I will do this. Okay.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation, opportunity to meet with you today. For matters of time and language, I've put the talk on the slide so I can go quickly. But just to say that for the past several years, I've been a part of a collective of sort of popularly known as the Black Urbanism Collective, made up of around 15 people from different parts of the world. Now, including some colleagues in Salvador, that have been interested in trying to think about what the very messy notion of blackness means for the very messy notion of the urban, and how these two messinesses, what they have somehow to do with each other in a heuristic way. We are not so concerned about something that is, albeit important, which is the kinds of experiences and conditions of Black inhabitation within different contexts of urban life. It is not to ignore or disattend to that, but this has not been the primary focus of our thinking together. Rather, it's more on the lines about, because of the past recent years when there's been a great deal of contestation, intense contestation, about what it means to be urban, particularly as the kind of equation between city and urban has itself been problematized and taken apart. What blackness may facilitate in terms of thinking about what the urban might be. This is a kind of a challenge that is, of course, haunted by Fanon to a large extent. Fanon himself had a very ambivalent relationship to notions of the urban. On the one hand, seeing the urban as a kind of place of complicity, of immiseration, but on the other hand, the urban being, in some sense, a locus of inventiveness. So, in some ways, as the prelude, some of the introductory remarks now are, in a large part, influenced by a kind of psychoanalytic thread of contemporary African-American, US-based thinking about some of these issues. So it is in a kind of Fanonian spirit of a kind of psychoanalytic reflection on notions of blackness, in part because this particular thread tries to, in some ways, not distance itself, but operate on a kind of different plane of consideration that in some ways isn't really captured by the, because in some ways what we know well and what we're familiar with is the way in which blackness has been folded into structures of racial capital as a means of extracting maximum value from property, the way in which it constitutes a population of captive labor, a population in waiting. And these are really important analytical language of which to understand particular aspects of blackness in its relationship to the urban. But it doesn't really deal with a more sort of comprehensive, expansive notion of how notions of blackness, which have been amongst us for centuries and centuries, in some ways relate to the constant reincipience of urban life. So in some ways, the notion of human striving from the get-go deals with notions of figuring, to come up with figures that constitute and populate relations with that which was encountered directly and indirectly. So the notion of the figure of man, the figure of the world, the figure of the home, the figure of the terrain, and every figure, you know, as Sylvia Wynter has emphasized, is a kind of a fiction. It's a fiction, it is an act of fiction to create a particular kind of image, a particular kind of story, but a story which is a powerful story, because it's a story in which one lives and in which which affects, as Wynter emphasizes, the very kinds of biocognitive operations of that which is considered the human. And the effects of figures take possession and give shape to what we are before we know or guess what they might mean, breaking with the real and turning the seemingly determined historical moment into an open space of possibility. So figures, in some sense, figuring reinvents thought, reinvents imagination and sensation. So figuring is not a representation of a pre-existent understanding. Figuration is a practice which, in some sense, shapes what is then felt and experienced as imagination and thinking. And figuring has been the purview of philosophy, eschatology, aesthetics, physics, and theology. And Black scholarship, particularly in recent years, has acquired an inordinate experience in exploring these particular kinds of archives, the archives of eschatology, aesthetics, theology, philology, from which emerges, that is, the exploration of those archives, emerges the notion that many Black scholars attempt to put forward, that Blackness is that for which no figure exists, and in which neither law nor power can be figuratively grounded. Yet it must be at the same time made to appear as the emblem of non-being. That is, no particular kind of figure of Blackness exists, not even the body of the Black inhabitant. Blackness is something that exceeds the figuration of that body, and Blackness is that which one cannot ground in terms of figuring the notion of law or particular structures of power. But at the same time, it comes to convey the sense of non-being. Now, figuration's most important maneuver is the determination of an edge. That is, it's not necessarily what's inside the figure, but what's more important is the edge of the figure, because the edge is what, in some sense, provides the definition of what is in or out, what's included, what's excluded, what belongs, what doesn't belong. And that edge, whether it's stable or mutable or mobile, I mean, figuring is not something that is like a metal cookie cutter that has a kind of stable edge to it. The edges are always, in some ways, oscillating. That which has been left out, uninhabitable, the edge is the point of incessant, or the point of incessant refiguration. So that which cannot be figured, or rather whose incessant figuring provokes uncertainty, is subsumed within the rationales of addition and subtraction. That is, what is lesser or more or less human, inhuman. All right. So the edge tends to be subsumed within this kind of mathematics, a kind of mathematics of adding, subtracting, which in some sense is a mathematics of comparison. And every act of comparison is a matter of making something lesser than something else. So the current moment, I mean, this moment that we're living through right now is in some ways the intensification, multiplication of anti-blackness. And anti-blackness not just as something against black people everywhere. It is that. I mean, it is this kind of, once again, this intense obsession with either suppressing black bodies or suppressing black aspirations, or as we're experiencing in the US right now, the kind of wiping out of the fact that blackness even existed within the United States as having to do with anything. But anti also in the presumption to mimic the force of blackness as the crisis of truth, that substitutes black revolt against a discernible, ineffable, unassailable truth. So in some sense, if nothing can be grounded, if the sense of the law, if the sense of a discernible, definable source of power can't be grounded in blackness, in some sense, the force of blackness is that it unsettles any conceit or any aspect that there is a truth. There is no truth of blackness. Blackness doesn't embody a particular truth. And blackness itself comes into the world as that which in some sense is somehow lesser or beyond whatever is considered as the truth. So anti-blackness in some ways is in some ways to undermine the black revolt against. I mean, Huey Newton, the figure of Huey Newton, when he said, well, there's no truth to the revolution. There is only the revolution. The revolution is not about deploying or unfolding or enacting a particular kind of truth. The revolution is simply the revolution. It is against all existing truths, all against assumptions. And so anti-blackness in some ways takes that spirit and turns it into something else. That is, for a politics, like Trump politics at the moment, where the declaration of anything can be construed as the truth. So in some ways, and taking from Fanon, that there is a kind of thought that comes before thinking. And that there are certain moments, where, as Fanon says, that there are certain thoughts that are unbearable, that one simply doesn't see, which the experience of being a specific kind of person cannot bear. And this situation provokes thinking. So a certain kind of thought before thinking. That is not our usual sense of things where thinking produces thoughts, but there's a certain kind of recognition, a certain kind of way of being in the world, and ascertaining that way of being in the world that one simply cannot bear, that is so infused with a sense of disorientation and uncertainty that precipitates a kind of thinking which is a kind of rational thinking, a linear type of thinking, of which one develops categories and concepts. And that in some ways, that here there is a something intolerable about thought itself, and the way that it fails to consolidate a solid standpoint. Instead, thought is peeled off and circumscribed through the procedures of rational thinking, that's oriented to deciding what things are definitively. Blackness attends to this. It faces the uncertainty. It pries open the multiplicity of seeing to bear witness to, in some sense, what Fanon calls the transcendental rootlessness of language. That language can never be settled for sure in terms of particular meanings that are added or subtracted, particular meanings that are stabilized, talking about language beyond its sort of semantic aspects, as a kind of force of, as a force in and of itself. So blackness in some ways is itself untranslatable and thus a threat, and necessitates then its containment within the carceral confines of language in relationship to the whiteness of the law that sustains anti-blackness that persists from within and without. So translation struggles to avoid terms and signs that would prevent it from working, and anti-blackness is used to both stabilize and undercut any order of signification and its arbitrary signs from within and without. It is this sense that blackness's untranslatability produces the possibility of translation and interpretation. It inhabits an irreconcilable oscillation between law-preserving and law-making violence. Somehow the slides are cut off here. The text is cut off. I don't know how to deal with it, but
Really? Let me see.
yeah.
I have it on. I have your presentation here if you want to.
Ja.
Do you have? You don't have. It's working this way.
Acho que é.
Let me see. Peraí, deixa eu fazer um negócio aqui.
Não, acho que é entre o Mac e
Oh.
o Windows.
Problems of. Look, do you see? Yeah, I'm seeing it here. You're right.
Maybe we
Is
can
it
show
okay?
it like
Maybe
this.
we can do it this way.
Yeah, okay.
Mami. Okay?
All right.
And you have the whole.
So in what Fanon suggests is that blackness appears in the world as that which in some sense has no specific kind of significance. Its significant, its only significance is that it then enables and allows a form of thought and form of being that prioritizes the sense that we are individuals with a sense of will, that we have thoughts and our thoughts are our own thoughts, and that through our own works and through our own sense of self-development, we can seek a kind of redemption, a redemption that somehow saves us from the otherwise inevitable fall into a kind of debilitating uncertainty through which we have no orientation and no ability to find ourselves in the world. And so the only significance of blackness then is that it then becomes the backdrop to that particular kind of capacity that enables the ability of the white individual to say, I think, therefore I am. So in some ways, blackness is not simply enters into the picture as a way of calculating certain kinds of persons as lesser than another. It comes to mean that, you know, in terms of the advent of racial capital, in terms of the colonial project, but it is also something that is also exceeds that. It is something beyond the available vernaculars, able to, in some ways, define what something is and what something is not. As I say, blackness functions in the world as both the lesser and the beyond, a simultaneity of subtraction and infinity without limits. So always this notion of the both end. So then blackness is not a racial identity per se. It is not a categorical equivalent or an alternative to whiteness. It is not exclusively territorialized or located within a specific status or even a specific body. After all, I mean, in the history of the use of blackness, who's black and who's not black, and who's eligible to claim the notion of blackness, or who's being attributed as black, covers a wide range of situations and characteristics that is permanently unsettled. Far from being a defining characteristic of a particular population, blackness is everywhere, not as a transcendental ontology or rubric, but as an earthly matter, a modality through which the earth comes to matter to all of those who dwell in it, and where dwelling is geared toward mastery. Blackness is the earth's refusal of such mastery. It enunciates itself as its suspension, its endless night of doubt. Because after all, mastery is predicated on a comparison. Mastery is predicated on a mathematics of subtraction or addition. It's predicated on a mathematics of comparison. One is a master over something. Right? So blackness is thus the earth's refusal of such mastery, because in a way it refuses, it doesn't entail that kind of mathematics. So there is a Philadelphia public intellectual, musician, artist, activist, quite an important figure, Carmen Ayala, who's known as Moore Mother, who in this text is part of an album called We Are on the Edge, the 60th anniversary of the Art Ensemble of Chicago. The Art Ensemble of Chicago itself is one of the most important black collective artistic endeavors of the 20th century in the U.S., and she has been a recent member of this. Art Ensemble of Chicago emerged from the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians in Chicago, a assemblage of several hundred of black musicians who all in some ways grew up together, and all who continued collaborating with each other, even being situated in all parts of the world. So I'll just. We are on the edge. We are on the edge of victory. After all that dope and dancing and drunkenness, we are on the edge. You hear that Tinky and Swamp Thing and Bella and Rosie and Cinderella? We are on the edge. We are on the edge of victory. Hey, Jitterbug, Pee-wee, Tweety Bird, Sissy, Ella Mae, Constance, we are on the edge. After all that dope and dancing and drunkenness, after all them church dinners and church trips and women's days and men's days, and the choir singing in the background. Yeah, we are on the edge of victory. All them sit-ins and daughters graduating from black colleges, only to return to the projects to gather the family out. We on the edge of victory. All of us. About a hope over the color line. Dripping in blood from the rat race. From doing time. From doing plantation time. From the blue-black blood stain on the flag of liberty. Or is it democracy? We are on the edge of existing. Enslaved chains and prison gangs. give you a sense of what's going on here. So what is the edge here? What is she talking about the edge being? And what's the edge of victory? What's the, here she's offering a lot of different fragments. A lot of different fragments, bits and pieces that are in some ways the flotsam, the residues of black life in North America. It's not organized in any kind of coherent narrative. It goes from cartoon characters to characters from slavery to characters from the militant resistance, not ordered in any particular way. So what's the figure here? What's the act of figuring? What kind of figure does, in some way, black existence emerge from something that is always on the edge, always in somehow question, never able to sort of settle for sure what's in, what's out, what's relevant, what's not, what's lesser, what's more. This is in some ways what More Mother is saying is that this is what we work with. This is what we live. This is the kind of constant figuring out that we have to always, in some sense, engage with. So she wavers across multiple registers of referentiality, from cartoon characters to stereotypes to shifting dispositions, for what might be just beyond that edge, as well as a refusal of whatever might be under a god or under a sun. And perhaps the edge is as far as one can go. Perhaps all maps only bring us to the edge of ourselves, something that will remain unknown, remain unoccupied. And this is perhaps the notion of victory, that one never goes over the edge, or if one does cross the edge into a kind of abyss, then nothing is lost and nothing is gained. Because you didn't start out with anything to begin with, in a way. There's nothing specific, categorical, or stable that you had that somehow is the thing that you are to begin with. And is it an escape from shutting down or closing what black life might really look like? As More Mother seems not to leave any edge unturned. She doesn't shy away from the most stupid characteristics of what black life might have been or what it has been portrayed of. She doesn't turn away from that particular kind of edge. And so in some ways I then jump in a very speculative way to what these notions of uncertainty, untranslatability, the notion of edge, have to do with the kind of reality of popular territories, particularly in Africa and Asia, where I have had, my work has been based for my life, in terms of what it is about these kinds of largely self-constituted popular territories that resonate with these sort of ideas about blackness. And as probably is familiar to you in a Brazilian situation, which I don't know all that well, is that in some ways the viability of everyday life within popular territories has to do with this sort of continuous notion of rearrangement. that life and infrastructure and materiality in the built environment is implemented in such a way as to maximize the possibility of always continuously being perhaps rearranged. That things are not sectorized in ways that are necessarily categorical or stable. It permits a kind of resilient circulation of residencies, of ideas, of knowledge, of resources, of ideas. And all of these kinds of arrangements inscribe actors in a series of interactions and forms of witnessing and gathering, and modes of being together that construct a particular kind of exposure to the larger world, that ensconce actors in materialized sensibilities of encounter that are specific to the immediate environments in which they operate. I gave the example the other night of a friend of mine who's done work in Sao Paulo for many years on the circulations of motorbike drivers who live in the periphery, and the way in which many of these motorcycle drivers, delivery drivers, are the ones who know the city, the region better than anyone anywhere else. And the way in which this particular kind of exposure to the larger city is something that's not just kept amongst them, but becomes a kind of opportunity and locus through which that kind of knowledge is circulated throughout the kinds of neighborhoods in which they reside and operate. And so the borders between territories may constantly shift between administrative designations, zones of social intimacy and emotional attachments, circuits of everyday mobility, and shifting forms of authority. Within Iztapalapa in Mexico City, a popular territory of 2 million people, the administrative designations that define particular kinds of territories are changing all the time. But also what's changing all the time are the particular kinds of relationships of social intimacy that exist amongst them, given on the changing population, given on what people do, given the kinds of divisions of labor that people undertake. Someone in the neighborhood does this, someone does this, someone does this. It allows particular kinds of exposures to the larger Mexico City. This is fed back into the neighborhood, permitting a rearrangement of their own economic activities, their own ways of dealing with each other. So in some ways, this sense of things being continuously rearranged is an essential aspect of the economic viability of the territory itself. Yet the ways in which the intersections amongst these different conduits of movement, the different intersections between how people move, how people live in domestic situations, the different modulations of what's public and what's private, which are also shifting all the time. A household, not necessarily a private space. Sometimes it is a private space, other times it is a public space. The relationship between neighbors who live in contiguous relationships with each other. Sometimes it's a kind of extensive household that becomes a form of publicity. Other times, other notions of privacy take place actually in what would look to be a private space. These are all being, in some sense, reworked. So the intersections between how people move, how they live in domestic situations, the relationship of public and private, the routines of the way in which everyday social reproduction takes place, and the way in which people feel about the way in which materials and designs of built forms, all of these things together generate a specific orientation and capacity, something specific. They exert a specific imprint on the larger urban surrounds. And this is not the only orientation or the only impact, but it is something specific. And what I mean by specific is that something gets invented, something is brought to life in a kind of Fanonian sense of it that is untranslatable, immeasurable. Something untranslatable and immeasurable that these arrangements bring about. That is, stuff that may look familiar, stuff that may look from, you go from one popular territory to another, across a single city, across different cities. It all might look like the same shit. But it's not necessary. I mean, in some ways, in the heart of these territories, is this capacity to produce something that can't be translated, that can't be captured by the normative categories of what is effective or not, what works or not, what is normal or not. It constitutes what might be called a form of material resistance, Laura, to the discursive-oriented domains of policy and design that seek to always outline relational frameworks, which seek to attribute specific values, positions, and measures of efficacy to a particular territory. So I mean, this is a kind of tricky question, because there are a whole lot of people out there, for example, that will say, "Oh, the periphery, yeah, it's subjected, it's oppressed, it's marginal, but look at what the informal sector is able to do. It's not that different from the kind of stuff that takes place elsewhere. We can translate it. We can, as some see its viability. We see how it resonates. We see a kind of functionality to it." I'm not talking about that. That may indeed be true. But there is a way in which the notion of popular territory, in its practices of rearrangement, and the notion of producing something specific and singular, understands in some ways, particularly from the point of view of blackness, that the only way to try to circumvent notions of being captured is not to get up and say, "I'm as good as everyone else, and I'll try to prove that I'm as good as everyone else," because that's not going to get you very far. It may get you in some ways positions in the municipality. It may get you better infrastructure. It may even get you a sense of citizenship, a kind of common citizenship. And not to demean that, because it's been very important in terms of Brazilian urban context. But it has a limit. It will only take you so far. And also the sense of a kind of resistance. Okay, sometimes popular territories will, in very assertive ways, and sometimes violent ways, say, "We're not going to buy into this. We're going to fight you off. We're going to actually, in some sense, put barricades in front of our territories to not let you in," and particularly not to let the police in or any kind of aspect of policing. And sometimes this is important, sometimes it works, but in a sense, what there is this kind of notion of trying to do something that is immeasurable, that can't be easily translated within the terms that otherwise will be governed. So it doesn't mean that relational frameworks are necessarily superseded by these specificities, only that another, albeit tacit, dimension of collective agency is materialized. It doesn't mean that it's the only game in town. There are always many games going on in town at the same time. But such specificity of material resistance can be important in terms of engaging the potential trajectories of territories that otherwise might look to be the same, or be subject to basically the same array of conditions, yet differ in terms of how they do or do not endure. Who makes it and who doesn't? What lasts and what doesn't? Every building may be recognizable according to some category, but it is always possibly something else. It may compress populations and activities in ways that simply cannot be easily compared. I mean, if you're a captive population, a marginalized population, a suppressed population, what do you do in order to endure? What is the relationship between the larger urban context that perhaps allows you some kind of space of maneuverability? Sometimes it's doing the right thing, sometimes it's doing not the right thing, and sometimes it means doing a thing that nobody gets at all except for you who are in the midst of doing it. So these arrangements precipitate an occasion navigation, that is a practice of trying to find one's way. That is the importance of circulation, the importance of paying attention, the importance of moving around. Because moving around enables you to be exposed to new kinds of experiences. If you stay put, you're going to know the same thing. You ain't going to get nowhere. So movement and circulation is a way, in some ways, to discover things, to invent things, to be exposed to a larger world, to have a sense of even thinking in a way that doesn't, in some sense, atrophy. So navigation is driven through the act of unknowing, the act of unknowing and social distancing, from that which is familiar, the familiar assumptions, the familiar ways of doing things. It is the act of putting off, of deferring any settling in of a dominant mode of valuation or ways of attributing significance and authority. I mean, we're all perfectly capable of saying, okay, you bring this to the table, this is what you do, and this is what you do. And I give you a value for that. Well, you know, for me, I think what you think and what you do is, you know, more important than what he thinks or what I do. He's sort of out of it, you know, but I, you know, in this kind of comparison of things that and if I make that kind of attribution, at what cost do I make it, you know? It may be easier to deal with you. Maybe you don't resist me as much. Maybe I can better control you. Maybe there's some sense that we're more alike. This guy over here is a little bit too scary. But if we all live like that, then in some ways, what do we miss? What kinds of opportunities, what kinds of potentials do we then miss? And in terms of captive territories, of popular territories, at times they can't afford to miss very much. They can't afford to miss nothing. Because otherwise, you know, they're always being subjected to changing policies. The police in various guises, different kinds of upgradings, different kinds of evictions, different kinds of ways of being messed with. And if you're being messed with it all the time in different ways, you can't afford to sort of stand with particular notions of what's valuable or what's not. It don't mean that people don't have their values. It don't mean that there's not things that are important to you that you try to reproduce and keep going. But in some sense, if you just settle that, if you're settled into that, somehow strategically you lose particular kinds of possibilities. That is, hedges against uncertainty are to be balanced with warding off entropy that comes from overly static orientations. After all, the density of materials, social compositions, livelihoods, and performances always suggest a wide range of possible inclinations and ways of doing things whose curtailment to keep them away requires a lot of effort, you know. You know, look at the amount of effort that like a household has to make to say, this is the household, we in this household, we insist upon particular ways of doing things. But that household is located in a larger surrounds where there's lots of different ways of doing things. And look at the amount of energy that household has to spend to ward off all those different other possibilities. Okay, it has to do it at times. It has, you know, in terms of maintaining sort of the recognition of the household through time. But there's a lot of energy to spend warding off and defending, in some sense, the outside world. How many families will tell their kids, I want to keep you from the street, you know? I want to keep you from this. You know, keep your ass in the house because that's the only way in which this family is going to be secure. There's some truth to that, but look at the amount of energy that takes in order to try to pull it off. So the costs and advantages of holding things down has to be constantly weighted with those of letting things go. Even if people find themselves completely in the dark, or at least feeling as if they are in some ways. So while what do we have? What do we for time?
12.
So what do we have?
10 more minutes?
Okay, all right, I'm going to go fast. So while tracing genealogies of development or appropriation may have important use, the complexions of these spaces seem detached from any inheritance nor suggestive of any judicious objective. I mean, every neighborhood, every territory, you can do a history, you can tell a story. But what I'm arguing is that in some ways, whatever story you tell about them, there's still a kind of sense of detachment from whatever the account may be. And while some of these spaces these territories may exude an atmosphere of haunting, of something not put to rest, they exist as a specificity that refuses relations that would always accord them some kind of value. Now, unsettlement now serves as the critical modality of governance and biopolitics. So instead of the volatility of all those exchanges of forces being stabilized through various administrative logics, such volatility is engaged instrumentally as a means of fostering resilience, continuous updating of behaviors, and tracking concerning what displaced bodies and populations can do. I mean, in many of the situations, in urban situations of the world, there's this kind of tension between the fact that people there's the sense that you can no longer stay in place if you're going to be able to survive. Urban economy doesn't allow that. You have to move. You have to go where opportunities are. You can't become too entrenched in one place. In the city that I've lived for a lot of the past years, in Jakarta, the rate of people changing residences has increased tenfold in the last 20 years. People simply don't stay put. They circulate, they're moving, but yet this mode of unsettling becomes also a kind of form of governance, because it allows you to track. So it's like policing. Policing has gone from, in some ways, trying to keep bodies in place. We no longer need to necessarily keep bodies in place. Now we can police also by all the ways in which we can track their movements. We can track circulation. You know, no matter where you try to hide, no matter where you try to go, we're going to find you. It isn't too difficult to do it. Look at the way of cell phone data. Look at the way in which you are available to be known, no matter where you're at. Don't have to keep your body necessarily in place. So not only are urban populations across much of the South less inclined or able to consolidate stable positions in specific places, but that this proliferation of different itineraries of movement contributes to the shifting terrains of extending urban regions themselves in a much more ambiguous patchwork of accelerated ascendancy and decline as residencies, projects, and investments are shifted from here to there in a panoply of extensions. And so I do a lot of work in terms of what these notions of extensionality are, because the notion of extensions, rather than settlement, become the kind of defining moment of the urban today. And in some ways, these notions of extensions are a refusal of white aesthetics. A white aesthetics which anchors the proper body as a locus of self-determination and freedom within the primacy of a kind of interior life. Here, the measure of the person is something always beyond what can be seen, heard, or touched. And this And so I talk about, in some ways, the way in which, within the kind of what Achille Mbembe talks about, the increasing blackness of the world, the way in which inhabitants actively seek to engage more multiple and heterogeneous series of occasions, not as resources or affordances to extract from, but to experiment with various ways to become aspects of different kinds of lineages, different kinds of collectivities. Okay. And so I talk about the Fred Moten has this notion of black and blur. And so I talk a bit about the sort of the blurring of the composition of territories, the blurring of the composition of whose house is whose job is even whose life is whose, as part of this notion of urban extensionality, particularly within physically the sort of vast territories of the periphery. In the city, again, of Jakarta, Jakarta has 10 million people. The periphery has 25 million people. So that 25 million people are occupying forms of urban existence that in some ways are quite different from the operative modes of inhabitation of the city itself. So blackness then as an extensionality that does not announce itself. It does not go and tell itself on the mountain that some Messiah has arrived, but is rather incisiveness in its ordinariness, its quiet profusion of gestures and touch, the cadences of enunciation, rather than the semantic content. The opening and closing of porous flesh exposed to the world, attentive to its wounds, yet sufficiently shape-shifting to operate in volatile environments, protecting its capacities to fold and unfold rather than defending any specific formation. It is in this way, then, that the urban is beyond inhabitation, even if habitability is retained as something critical to the livingness of flesh. And so no matter how the urban technical acts to secure whiteness, it does its job in part because it increasingly becomes black. And what do I mean by that? So to viably manage the deleterious footprints of our existence and the widespread implication of any single event, efforts are now made, the whole logic of urban governability, the whole logic of the way in which urban life and space is governed, centers on efforts to calculate the probable impact of specific scenarios upon current conditions, to find ways of calculating what money, material, genes, codes, mathematical sets, buildings, forests, atmospheres, metabolisms, viruses, derivatives, animals, and instruments have to do with each other. The name of the urban governance game is interoperability. How do you find a language that in some ways gives a kind of account and a scenario of what all of these categories have to do with each other in terms of a prospective future? That is, to have something to say about contingencies of all kinds. That is, urban governance is no longer interested in trying to stabilize conditions. It knows that it can't do it. It knows that turbulence and volatility are inevitable aspects of urban life. And rather, how do you use that turbulence and volatility, all the shifting ways in which these different factors can relate to each other, as a way to exert some kind of control? And so as humans set out to set more elements in relationship to each other, a larger plurality of eventualities is created, as well as a kind of city, a kind of urban life populated by strange creatures, hybrid entities, agents that are neither alive nor dead, new forms of transmission and conveyance that are not searchable or always changing course. For the grounds on which digital and algorithmic governments endeavor to guarantee specific decisions is itself predicated on operations which by their nature have no guaranteed course of action. If you look at the way in which algorithms work, algorithms in some sense live through uncertainty. That there are things that algorithms produce that we have no language to understand. Dispositions, perspectives, scenarios by which we have no language to interpret. So while algorithmic operations attempt to affect what specific entities will do, like us, and how we think, and what we buy, and how we decide, and how need make no reference to the physical world. They bypass any form of representation, potentially discovering actualities for which we have no language. And in that way, then, untranslatable, fungible, all over the place, urban life is a black world, and there's no urbanism that is not black. Thank you.
Thank you, Malik. Many thanks. So I would like to hand over to Fernanda and Laura, yes, in this order.
So go first.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor Malik, for the talk. It was a moment of great learning and thought for me. And I have to admit that I prepared myself for the comments here that I have to make by reading some of your texts. And so some of my comments are related to the text, some to the talk you just gave, because I think you're like advancing your thoughts on Black urbanities that are not like necessarily on the books. And it was great because it gave me lots of food for thought. So I'll start with my first comment that's actually really connected to what's Black, what's poor when we think about the urban environment. I have worked for a long time with slums in Brazil and Latin America too. And well, when we talk about Brazil, we have, I mean, of course it's a debate, but I think we have like a preconception of what's Black and what's not Black, etc. When we go to the north of Brazil, I mean, we have much more indigenous population, etc. And when I first read your text, I really had this thing in mind. I mean, I know you mentioned that Black is the absence of figure, is the edge. I mean, it's the thing or the group for which no figure exists. But perhaps this is like an addiction, like of trying to define things. But I was really like, when I think about Black urbanities, I think there is like, you mentioned that's not racialized, not territorialized, but for me, it kind of has a connection with like urban poor population. So I would like, if possible, if you could talk some more about if it's possible to territorialize, to racialize. I mean, perhaps what's Blackness is what's not white. It's kind of, it's not a figure, but it's the absence of whiteness. And inside this definition, there is different possibilities of racial profile, for example. And also, I mean, I was very intrigued by this idea of Blackness and Black urbanities. And from my experience, I mean, you mentioned here in your talk that, as you said here, there is a way of being in the world that precipitates thinking and being and the endurance. And when we go to, I mean, popular territories, for example, there are conflicts, lots of conflicts. I mean, different forms of thinking. So some forms of thinking, and you mentioned in your talk, in Brazil, we have a long experience of popular movements somehow approaching official governmental structures, but using different strategies. But it's a common strategy in our past. But at the same time, we have lots of different forms of resistance. So what really got me thinking is, I mean, how to push Black urbanities in the way you think, the way you conceptualize it, to a broader population. I mean, because for me, there is like a tension between resistance and accommodation between the possible group that forms the Black urbanities, and how to somehow navigate these tensions of positions with regards to the official institutions. My second question, well, I come from the public policy field, so, and I have a history with support of slum dwellers' mobilization processes. So I guess I have some questions that somehow aim to connect more to practice and to political activism. So my second question is, when we think about the mobilization of the urban majority beyond endurance, I actually heard one podcast in which you participated that you mentioned that urban politics is full of conflicts because you're in a territory disputing power. And here, you mentioned in the presentation that the Black urbanities should distance itself from familiar assumptions from the white aesthetics. And my question is, if we are to push forward the urban majority mobilization, what would be more valuable pathways in terms of policy making? So would it be via electoral representations, via protests? And because in your, and I understand that you are highlighting in the talk and in your reflection, like the current the daily processes of the Black population, the Blackness, the population in this context. But would it be interesting for this population to mobilize into official politics or not? Because this is already a contaminated environment. And I'm also thinking about, there is one text in which, and also in some of the podcasts, you talk about a life worth living in a time of climate emergencies. So I was also wondering in this second big question about mobilization of urban majority, I mean, what could be, if they go to official political arenas, what would be like more strategic or, I don't know, better mobilization demands? So would it be, well, I mean, to really be able to have a life worth living, to have better housing, or not to have, because it's a different moment with very unstable housing. So what would be, from your perspective, an interesting political agenda for this movement? My third question is about public policy making in general, specifically housing, because I have studied, especially in my PhD, slum upgrading programs in Brazil. And I mean, historically, we have some initiatives of eviction. I mean, you just take everyone out. But there is also, in Brazil, we have, well, a considerable experience with slum upgrading, financed by the federal government. And these programs, they have actually been born with some dialogue with movements and Islam dwellers, and they have guidelines and principles that, in principle, dialogue with the urban dynamics in these territories. But when they are implemented, they have several setbacks and problems. And there is a professor, Rosana Denaudi, here from the Federal University of ABC. We conducted a research together, and she has lots of research on this issue. And she says that slums have a different time. Slums are always changing. I mean, it's never fixed. And I somehow connected to your argument, because she says the government comes and they first have to have a very detailed diagnosis. They have to prepare the project, etc. And when government comes back, it's already a different setback. It's a different territory. So it's really like different logics. And this has got me thinking for some time. The government somehow is not prepared to, I mean, government that has a progressive agenda and is not interested in evicting everyone, even this kind of government has a lot of difficulty, a great difficulty, because, I mean, it's a bureaucratic administrative process that, even when they try, does not really dialogue with slums and peripheries timings. And my last question is more connected to the relation between theory and practice, especially, it's more a methodological question, because it's obvious that you have, you're immersed, embedded. I mean, you live in Jakarta, and imagine you are circulating there. But I was wondering, how do you collect, analyze data? I mean, do you use ethnographic methods, participatory action research methods? Do you go to meetings with dwellers, municipalities, and from that you collect ideas? I mean, do you prepare a project, an idea, and dialogue with people? How do you connect through methodological tools your theoretical thoughts with your practical insights? Well, it was a great pleasure to learn and to comment, and I think these are my main thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernanda. Laura.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for great comments, Fernanda. I will speak a bit more from my recent experience in São Paulo. So first of all, let me say it's an honor to respond to your presentation as a discussant, respond to work that refuses easy resolutions, and that points to the power of urban collectivity as emerging from Black urbanities and its edges. So I want to start my comment by taking up Malik's provocation of thinking the city not necessarily, from consolidation, from density, from integration, but from brokenness. So from that which resists being repaired into a seamless whole, to be settled, to be stabilized, to be organized, to be controlled. And this is something that Malik has brought us in the first session of the winter school course that some of you have attended, where he provoked us to think human settlements as made through a constant unsettling of places and people extending themselves beyond the ways in which they have previously been known. And in your presentation, you have introduced this idea of the constant refiguration, refiguration, the impossibility of determining an edge, where the edge is an abyss, something that cannot be determined. You have introduced blackness as more than a racial identity that goes beyond representations, if you will, that for which no figure exists as an earthly matter that provides the grounds for dwelling, habitation, and that through its modes of being together, of gathering, of exposure, of witnessing, and of constant movement, generates a form of material resistance, a resistance to being counted, to being stabilized, defined, figured. So this perspective, this is why I wanted to repeat this, this thought. This resonates strongly with my own experience in São Paulo. In São Paulo, São Paulo is a football club, which I'm also a fan of. My experience in São Paulo and all these collaborations that have emerged over the past years, with people like Roselini Tavares in Glicério, with Michel in Bexiga, with Adão from the Movimento Negro Unificado, with Rafael, Paulo Rafael from the Soweto Organização Negra. So these are some people that we plan to bring Malik into contact with in the next days. And you are all also invited. We said it on Monday that we are visiting Glicério tomorrow and Bexiga on Saturday. And there's more movements like the Mobiliza Saracura Vai Vai, who have also attended your talks. There's collaborations with people like Stella Paterniani, who was also here in the talks and with whom I work on concepts of repair and reparation. And I wanted to bring this perspective of the floodplains, of the várzeas, of the wetlands of São Paulo, just to dialogue with what you have presented, and maybe also as an attempt to dialogue from an empirical case, and to think about how I can translate some of your thoughts on Black urbanism to these sites that we have been working with. So I think these várzeas, these floodplains, wetland areas, are actually living evidence that São Paulo is Black and indigenous grounds. So São Paulo é terra preta indígena. Várzeas have long been territories of blackness. They have been territories of refuge, arrival, of punishment, of resistance. So there's the quilombos urbanos, such as the Quilombo Saracura in Bexiga, which you will visit on Saturday, and which is somehow on the other side of this triangle that we have visited with Freya on our walk on Sunday of the historical center. It's on the other side of the river. It's on the other side of the valley, and it has been a place of refuge, of hiding in the dense vegetations that once also provided pathways for indigenous resistance. And I wanted to bring also Nikolao Sevchenko, who is actually the guy that gave the name to the auditorium where you have been presenting. So Sevchenko reminds us also of the Várzea as a site of disposal of Black bodies and of waste of the city, of the unwanted remainder of the urban order. So Glicério in this sense is also territory of circulation, where enslaved people from the coastline have arrived, climbing up the plateau, and later and today also migrants from Haiti, from Guinea, from other African countries. So these várzeas in this sense are places of unsettling, I would say, but they are also places of sites of whitening, of erasure. So, as many of you know, the principal streets of São Paulo have been designed to erase rivers, right, to cover over rivers, but with them also the history of Black and indigenous populations. So these are the metaphors of hygienization, asphaltization that go together with the process of branqueamento, of whitening. And this is something that figures, in the first urbanists of São Paulo, Adolfo Pinto, for instance, who expresses this fear, as Michelle has brought me, of the so-called watercress growers, of the wash women, Black women who are washing clothes in the rivers, of all these populations from the northeast of Brazil, from descendants of enslaved populations that inhabit these lowlands, these Black territories. And the will, Adolfo Pinto in this first urban reform expresses the will to cover over these rivers, to bring progress and modernity to these territories, to settle them, to make them habitable in this sense. So again, coming with Shevchenko, this historian, he provokes us to think the city by the Várzea, by these territories, to think it from exactly by what it hides, what it relegates, what it sweeps under the carpet. This is the words of Shevchenko, of its urban landscape. There's bodies, spaces, and presences that present a counterpoint to the pretended identity of the city. They are its most complete negation. And this is what they reveal, that they reveal what the city fears to be revealed, the bare face behind this fantasy. So I think this has a lot to do with what you're saying about whiteness, that actually in the first class also you brought this picture of piles of waste, so to say, of unidentifiable things. And actually, you were pointing us to that whiteness, without the pretense of white order, masks the fear that it's nothing more than a pile of something, right? So this really reminded me a lot of what we will see in Glycerio when we walk through the streets, when we see the catadores, the waste pickers, the recycling centers, these piles that come somehow defy the idea of white order. And in another way, what I would also wanted to bring in is that what Giselle Brito, a colleague also from the architecture department here at VUSP, has recently taught me that one of the achievements of the Black movements in these areas, of the Mobiliza, Saracura Vai in specific, is that I talked about the first urbanist of São Paulo, but the recent reform to the master plan of São Paulo, to the Plano Diretor from 2023, defines Bexiga, so the other Várzea, the other river lowland, as a Black territory. So it actually states that also inside the city, we have the idea of the peripheries, we have the idea of the quebradas, which is also associated with brokenness and fragmentation, but also inside the city, there's Black territories, like these Várzeas, and they have a majority of Black population according to the census. So this is one of the achievements also of the Black movements in these neighborhoods, of the persistence or endurance of these movements, but in the same time, it's also I think it's an example of refiguring boundaries, right? Of provoking these kinds of what is actually defined in the master plan as which kind of territory, and shift also this kind of administrative reading of these territories. Do I have 2 minutes? Yeah? Okay. So I also wanted to point, because this is something that Frei and I have been working with more recently, so the idea of Malcolm Ferdinand, of decolonial ecologies, and the idea of the double fracture, which again reconnects to what we have been talking about, brokenness, but at the same time also points us to how actually these strange alliances that are emerging in these territories between, let's say, ecological movements like Michelle is also representing, so to actually mobilize a river in order to protest against gentrification, against displacement, and so on, so to mobilize environmental laws, but at the same time, and also laws of historical patrimony and heritage, of course, which comes with an ecological idea also of heritage, right? of the grottos and so on, of these landscape configurations, to mobilize these kind of ecological evidence, but at the same time to also read the sediments of these rivers and mobilize Quilombo memories and presences, right? This is something that I've been thinking a lot about, and I think it's really something that, yeah, I would like to hear you reflect more about, of these unlikely alliances that unsettle, of extension also in the sense of extending compassion, and of really thinking about, so what does it mean to think the city through blackness? What kinds of urban collectivity become visible? What kinds of urban collectivity emerge from this? And as a last point, I think we have been talking about this a lot already in your courses. There have been questions about the method of fabulation as a way of speculative futurism, also that emerges from the idea of extensions. But also you have been talking a lot about the difficulty actually of evidencing relations that are difficult to empirically evidence, right? And then you evoke Trumpism, and you evoke how the idea of the absolute truth is actually something. So how do we deal with this actually, when at the one hand we want to, this goes very much into the direction of what Fernanda also asked, so how do we empirically, methodologically, how do we, with what kind of, dynamics do we work empirically to actually produce evidence about material resistances, but at the same time not falling into this trap of truthism, So yeah, I will end with this.
Yeah, thank you
so much.
Thank you, Laura. Let me just ask Malik, is it possible to ask here, to open for the public, for them to ask questions, and then you make a last comment? Yeah, I think perhaps we could. Alguém tem perguntas ou comentários that you would like to pose?
Pode ser em português.
Pode ser em
também.
português, não tem problema, a gente traduz aqui. Algum comentário a fazer?
O Adão.
Adão, por favor. Pera, você pode vir até aqui ou porque está gravando? Por favor.
Bom, bom dia a todos. Umas palavras e outras em inglês a gente entende e tal, então na fala dele eu consegui assimilar alguma coisa, mas pelas fotos parecia que estava falando aqui de São Paulo, da periferia e tal, assim por diante. Tem um livro que a maioria das pessoas conhece chamado Quarto de Despejo, né?
Eu esqueci também.
É que dialoga com a questão da urbanização, né? E esse olhar, né? Quem promove a urbanização, com que autoridade, com que financiamento, né? Então, quando a Laura cita a Gisele Brito, a questão do plano diretor num território que historicamente é um território negro, que é o Bexiga, mas que na visão da gestão pública não tem valor. Então, o que aconteceu com Carolina Maria de Jesus na década de 50, 40, 50, acontece novamente com uma escola de samba centenária e com os moradores negras e negros que residem no território e que, pela imposição do mercado imobiliário, estão sendo expulsos, né, para outros territórios. E a minha indagação é como que se constrói uma nova visão com participação social, onde as pessoas sejam cidadãos e e senhores, né, do seu destino. Obrigado.
Build or constitute another vision where people are included, as citizens that define their own destiny. So how can we promote this kind of view? Né? Alguma outra pergunta? Okay, I will not. I have actually some questions, but I think I will leave it for the end to finish. It's just a comment, but I think now you can, if you want us to address the comments and questions.
I mean, I think the question of how to put together the possibility for such inclusiveness increasingly depends upon where. I mean, because in many cities across the world, at least the urban core, that those areas where a place like Bexiga would be located is becoming increasingly an abstraction. It's a city not for people to really reside. It's a place where financial transactions, the determination and the maximization of value through abstract financial calculations are being derived. I mean, how is it possible that within urban core that you find large apartment blocks that are almost completely empty, but where the emptiness has nothing to do with the viability of the project itself? Rather, it's an occasion, the building itself is an occasion for transactions that link together different kinds of money, across different kinds of geographies, and particularly when the built environment becomes an accessible way of cleaning money that is derived from who knows what kinds of sources. So, I mean, I've had real estate project developers tell me many times, we don't care about the profitability at the moment. That's not why we're doing things. Eventually something will happen. We aim for the eventuality of something. And we don't know whether or not it'll come about or not. So why I'm saying this is that there are terrains within the city particularly that inhabitation is not on the table, basically. Period. Whether or not it includes or excludes, it's just not on the table. And so in some ways it's hard to make the political claim that somehow those existing associations, those existing populations are vital to the continuation of that terrain. That's just how things are. I mean, when I talked about this notion of material resistance and about the production of specificities that are immeasurable, that are incommensurable to sort of normative frames of efficacy, that are untranslatable, I tried to emphasize that, again, this is not the only thing taking place. There are still politics of relationality that have to be negotiated in terms of the relationship of any territory to a larger frame of reference, to the larger urban region, to the state, to the, and that doesn't change. It's just that we persist somehow in particular kinds of tactics that we've rehearsed for 60, 70 years now, that in some ways do produce some kinds of improvement in the material living conditions of some residents, but it doesn't change the basic conditionality under which the majority of urban residents, lower working class, the poor, the working poor, basically live. And there's an increased tendency on the part of activist organizations, such as, you know, the Asian Coalition for Housing Rights, which has been operative for now almost 50 years in terms of trying to improve the conditions of popular territories. Well, they'll simply say, life has become so complicated and so messy that we have to pick and choose those areas in which to work, which are more amenable to having their situation accounted for in terms of affordability, in terms of the ability of residents to organize in normative ways, which can sort of build these sort of co-op projects that, you know, people buy into. But what is lost in the process is any kind of understanding of the complexity, the sort of social, political complexities of what they tried to accomplish in the first place. I mean, it's not to say that policy is not important. We have to continue trying to do it, even if it's even ritualistically. But from what I see from Delhi, from Mumbai, from Manila, from Jakarta, from Bangkok, from Saigon, from Lagos to Abidjan to Johannesburg, is that all of the enlightened policies that have been attempted don't really change much of anything. What it does oftentimes change is that it folds residents into a mode of accounting for their life in ways that there's a promise that if they do so, it will maximize their integration into the city, maximize their status as citizens, but it doesn't really do that. I'm not saying that people shouldn't do it. They have to do it. People have to learn how to play different games at different times, multiply. That's all. That's basically what I'm saying. And you're right. Many popular territories experience very times intense levels of contestation, because the different games that people have to play don't always go along so well together. There are those that are determined to do one game, and there are others that are determined to do another, and there are another determined to do a third, at least the three main games I'm trying to outline. They don't sit well together. They're not easily integrated, particularly within a kind of overarching social movement. And so contestation and even violence become almost an intrinsic part of life in some ways. I don't see a way around that. Outside of, you know, the usual things about bringing in the police, but why bring? No one wants to bring in the police, because the police just make things worse. But again, I want to emphasize that we have to keep trying. It doesn't mean that we stop. It's just that, you know, the capacity to play multiple games with different kinds of sequencing and rhythms is something that is constantly a work in progress. Now, in terms of methodology, this is how do we do this? And the thing is that there are certain tricks that at least we've learned in Jakarta. We have many universities in Jakarta. There are many architecture departments. There are a few urban studies departments. There are many students that are working on projects that have to do with the city. and particularly postgraduate projects. Now, oftentimes these students are doing things on their own, by themselves, in their particular department, or or trying to seek an NGO to work with, people to work with. It takes some organizational effort, but in some ways is worth it. Why don't we find ways to do this together? Why should postgraduate students that are working on different parts of the city necessarily have to do it alone? You can organize. So in Jakarta, we've organized collective groups of 20 to 30 postgraduate students at a time, working in different neighborhoods. They meet several times a month. They discuss what they're doing. They support each other. And in a way, we get a broader sense of the nature of different kinds of affiliations, different kinds of processes that are underway. That's one thing. But methodologically, it is difficult, because in some projects where we've attempted to sort of follow particularly young people around in their daily life, we put a lot of effort into following 40 people for 1 year in terms of their itineraries. And you begin to see that these itineraries are really complicated. They entail, they entail working long hours in a small market. They entail, working long hours, going to school on the side, dealing a little bit of drugs on the side in order to pay for this, living not with their family, but living somewhere else. Their family's over here. Someone else is taking care of their kids. They have all of these multiplex relationships with a large field of a broad geography across different kinds of sectors. And when are they going to have time to be part of any kind of organization, any kind of political organization? But yet, these multiple this is how people are living their life, and they're making all kinds of temporary alliances in ways that are unbeknownst to them, maybe when they were high school students, some 5 to 10 years ago. But we wouldn't know that unless we tried to follow people, got the cooperation of being able to follow people around. And then there are territories in the city that just go unaccounted for. Every city has its favorites, the favorite NGO place, the favorite association that puts itself on the map, and it draws researchers and activists and policymakers, and it becomes a kind of lab or a kind of model, and it sort of represents a certain favela for popular territory. Meanwhile, there are all kinds of spaces in the city that no one has ever heard of before, and no one ever chooses to interact with before. So also methodologically is important. How do you work your way in to the multiplicity of spaces that are out there that don't put themselves on the map in any kind of particular way? But it's an important. It's a really critical question. And then, Laura, thanks for both of you. Thank you for the comments. Thank you for, providing me some kind of knowledge about, the Sao Paulo, the Brazilian situation, and what was at the end you asked a particular question, Laura. You wanted to know more about something that I now have
about the evidencing of
the evidencing
yes. of these kinds of relations that are difficult to evidence, and also how to work with this in the face of claims to truth that are
this is I would just perhaps Fernanda's first question, this idea of what does blackness mean in relation to the idea of white or not, or to the group? Or she said, is blackness not being white? Would you say that it's because we have indigenous groups, we have?
Yeah, but in some sense, if blackness comes into the world in some sense, to constitute the foundations of whiteness, then it simply cannot be that which is not white. It always has to exceed that position. So even the absence of whiteness has to absent itself in some ways as a. I mean, it is a tricky conundrum. Because in some ways, what we're in the collective, what we're attempting to do is sort of think about the application of blackness to urban life without necessarily grounding it and focusing on the conditions of black residents within urban conditions. It's not that it isn't crucial; it is crucial. But in some, and whether or not how one does that is always a politically fraught and ethically fraught kind of position. But yeah.
Thank you. Many thanks to everyone. I would just like to, very briefly, Malik, if possible, just be given to tell you, I don't know whether you would like to react, but to consider that what you are, even though you my impression is that even though you frame your discussion in a very broad, theoretically very broad way, and actually as an urban reflection, my impression is that for our department, if we think here, that we are at the Department of Sociology, I think there are some crucial thoughts, even if you don't work on urban stuff and so on. And given that our audience here also includes people from that work on other issues, I would say that what you are proposing, and this is a bit of my reading, is that blackness is a methodological perspective of having a look into the world we live in. We could even think of what is happening in the forests, because it's a way of which is embedded historically in the way capitalism developed itself via slavery, via this kind of exploration, whose major and target victims were black people being transferred from Africa to Brazil. This is a bit of my reading, and if we think it in this terms, I think we have a possibility for us who are here at the Department of Sociology, thinking sociology from very different angles, to conceive that we are talking about issues like the social and historical foundations of prejudice, social prejudice, the ways prejudice become spatial, the spatial forms prejudice takes in cities. We are also talking about a sociology of knowledge, because it's a way you are talking. Actually, I was making some connections with this idea of a sociology of everyday knowledge. We have a sociologist here in Brazil at USP, José de Souza Martins, who works a lot on this idea of the ways of knowing in everyday life. And he also proposes a sociology of the victim. You're actually talking about the victims, and the way victims produce they are victims of this whole way of producing space and historically producing space, and what do they invent and what do they make out of it? Which has not been which has not been conceptualized. And last but not least, you are also talking, and I myself also work a lot on everyday life, sociology of everyday life. You are talking about, and you talked a lot about this fluidity, this temporal fluidity as such. So you have you're talking about what it means, and this is something I see a lot by working with and on homeless people. What it means to have an everyday life that is non-everyday, né? That is made of non-everydayness, né? So what is a routine made of non-routine, an existence of a routine, né? So this contradiction and, né? So that's it. I don't know what you want like to say, anything. Just, yeah? So I would like to thank you all, especially you two, and also Adão for your question. Muito obrigada. And I'd like to thank you all, and hopefully you've enjoyed this exchange. Tá? And tomorrow, Professor Malik will be at 6 o'clock at the auditório Nicolau Sevicenko, né? Saudoso Nicolau Sevicenko, for the third lesson of this winter course, okay?
E para quem quiser, de manhã, né, às 9h30.
Ah, yeah, and in the morning. Quer falar?
Nós encontramos às 9h30 na estátua da Madrinha Eunice, lá na estação
Liberdade.
Liberdade, né? 9h30, certo? Para quem quiser caminhar, vamos caminhar pelo Glicério.
Legal, muito obrigada. Um abração, tá? Um bom dia para todos aí, tá? Tchau, tchau.
Obrigada.